Hey everybody, so I just got done with my last round game in Gibraltar. It ended in a draw, and actually I missed some chances in this game. Overall, it was pretty solid, but as you'll see, I definitely could have maximized my initiative a little bit more. Well, to sum up, I finished with 5.5 out of 10, and I'll probably give my general impressions of my play at the end of this video. But overall, it was a pretty decent performance. I think rating wise, my performance rating was like 2480 or thereabouts, which is okay given my current rating is like low 2400s. But definitely could have been better. Looking back at the tournament, I feel like I had some pretty solid games and some games that were pretty tough where I felt like I didn't even have many chances. But yeah, so for this last round, I was facing Grandmaster Valentin Dragnev from Austria, and I was playing white. I started with knight f3. This is the final round, and this was a morning round. So instead of 3 p.m., which is the usual start time, this game started at 11 a.m. And morning rounds are infamous because number one, you get less time to prepare. So players typically show up less prepared and are more ready to wing it. And secondly, chess players are stereotypically night owls and are not that great in the morning in terms of having their brains work properly and at full speed. So you see a lot of strange blunders, and I think the final round had a ton of decisive results and a lot of upsets as well. So I would encourage you guys to check out some of those games on Chess24 because there were some some pretty hectic affairs. I decided to play knight f3 versus my usual 1d4 just to I think just keep it more flexible because again there wasn't a lot of time to prepare, so I figure rather than go for d4 and maybe some sharp main lines, I wanted to keep it kind of more simple. So knight f3, knight f6, and here I decided to go g3. So essentially my idea was almost to play like a reverse King's Indian because I just felt like, okay, technically it's going to be like a ready type position, but since I'm familiar with like the King's Indian, here I get an extra tempo. At least it's going to be a playable endgame. I wasn't really expecting to get an advantage with white, but rather just some playable position and hopefully try to find some chances to capitalize on later. So bishop g2, bishop f5, he goes for this setup, which is essentially a reverse London, and I think it's one of the most solid ways for black to play. D3, bishop e7, and here I went b3. So I've seen this position a few times from reverse colors, playing black, the King's Indian, against the London system. I'll go for this setup, and I'm quite fond of it, so I basically wanted to give it a test run here as white. Objectively, probably c4 or the move knight h4 are probably going to be more ambitious tries for the advantage. But having not really, prepared these lines, I didn't want to just go for something and not be exactly sure what I'm doing. This is a pretty typical idea, knight h4 trying to take the two bishops. I imagine black would probably play bishop g4, and then white typically pushes the bishop back, and we get some position like this where I can take the bishop on g6, but I've also weakened myself a bit on the king side, and so black gets some compensation against this. In any case, I decided just to, again, keep it simple and solid. b3, castles, bishop b2. He goes for c5, which I think is probably the best move in the position. Black could also play c6, but well, it just kind of leads to a different structure. c5 is a little bit more ambitious, but I think it makes a lot of sense. The knight comes to c6. And compared to the typical London, black has actually kind of saved the tempo here because he hasn't really needed to play h6. Normally white will make this move to keep the bishop on the board and have a chance to go back, but as black, they don't really mind giving up the bishop here, so they can kind of save on this tempo. I played knight bd2, knight c6, and here I think it's a very important idea for white to play knight to e5 and fight for some space. Because if black is allowed to push d4 in this type of position, even giving up the c4 square, it's kind of worth it because my bishop on b2 really will get locked out of the game. So I need to make sure that this doesn't happen. I think a positional blunder would be a move like c4 here, allowing d4, and then black just gets incredible amount of space, and then e5 is coming in. Yeah, the bishop on b2 is really sad. So knight e5, and one way or another these knights are getting exchanged, so black takes on e5, bishop takes e5, and now d4 is harder to push because the b7 pawn is of course hanging. Bishop g6, good move. I think it's a very flexible decision, and also black gets out of the way of e4. For instance, if a move like bishop d6 or something like this, I would definitely consider taking here and then pushing e4. And it feels like white gets some small initiative here. Let's say bishop g6, the queen typically comes to e2, and then I'm already threatening e5. I also have ideas of playing, let's say f4, h3, and then f5, and trying to trap the bishop on g6. So this is one of white's main plans, playing for this like e4, f4 advance on the king side. So he prophylactically gets out of the way of that. So here I had a bit of a think. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to commit to c4 just yet, because after c4 I'm not really threatening to do anything here. If I take, he just recaptures and his structure is perfectly fine. Eventually he'll play b6 to support the c5 pawn. So I wanted to keep my options open. I also didn't really like the looks of playing e4 here. I actually am having a hard time trying to remember why I didn't want to go for this move, or maybe I just wanted to be more flexible. But this would make sense with, again, the idea of like queen e2 and f4. I'm not sure exactly what black does here. After the game we were looking at queen a5 followed by rook a d8, and it seemed like black is getting a reasonable position here anyway. So I played h3 instead. I think this is like a useful move in the position. It's covering the g4 square. I can now play f4 and not ever worry about knight g4. And also this move ends up being very useful later, because if black ever plays bishop h5, in the future might be targeting the e2 pawn. I always get this tempo with g4, and so I'm never having to worry about this this threat. So now he goes for knight d7. I go back, bishop b2, and bishop f6. Okay, he wants to trade off the bishops. I think it's quite reasonable. I played queen c1 here. And okay, if he takes on b2, I'll happily recapture with the queen, and I think the queen is placed very nicely on this square. And white's typical plan, I think, in these types of positions is to try and prepare the b4 break, and also typically play with c4, just trying to maximize the power of the bishop on g2. I mean, it doesn't look like much, and objectively black is definitely fine, but long term the strategic plan here is actually to just play against the bishop on g6, because it's hitting this pawn on d3, which is very well guarded by the pawn on e2, so I can push c4 and not worry about the pawn. And the bishop feels very restricted. Meanwhile, my bishop on g2 is always going to be having pressure on the d5 pawn, especially after c4, and so if black ever moves this pawn or advances, then the bishop opens up on the whole diagonal, and that's very nice for white. So I think there is some strategic poison, let's say, in these types of positions. Black goes rook b8. I thought this was quite interesting. He's getting his rook off of the diagonal and preparing a future b5 to gain some space. And it's like black is the one with the space advantage here. It's like colors are reversed, but okay, white has some ideas too. Bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, and here I decided to finally go for c4. And yeah, I'm just putting a little bit of pressure on the d5 pawn here. I think I was expecting a move like b6, and I'm not sure exactly how I would follow up here, maybe a3 or maybe a queen move, but yeah, my plan hasn't really changed. I just want to put the queen here and prepare this push with b4 and just try to get something going on the queen side. Whenever black takes, I'm always recapturing with the knight to keep my pawn on d3 nice and solid. After the game, we were looking at queen d6, which I think is probably the best move in the position. And the engine evaluates this as equal, but you know, honestly, it actually feels like white is not really getting a whole lot of ideas in, and it feels easier to play black. At least that's kind of the conclusion we came to after the game, because yeah, I'm not really getting b4 in, but black is very quickly playing b5. So for instance, if I play a3, black just plays b5, and structurally I think black is doing quite well. Wherever I take, black recaptures, and yeah, my b3 pawn ends up weak here. In other cases, like the d5 pawn just remains extremely solid, Rook can come to c8 or b8, and yeah, I'm not really getting anything in this position. So objectively, white is fine here. I'm not sure what I would have done during the game. Something like queen b2, let's say b5, takes, e4 is also possible. And yeah, I think both sides are just kind of okay here. Maybe I slightly prefer black because it kind of just feels like black's position is a little bit more compact, especially once I play e4, and then my d3 pawn ends up a little weak. So yeah, maybe slightly easier to play black, but objectively, definitely this is the way black should have gone. In the game after c4, he actually thought for a bit and pushed d4, which I was very, very surprised by, because there was just no reason to commit to this move and open up the diagonal. And it just seemed like he was giving me all the play in the position. Because now my bishop is opened up, the d3 pawn is fully secure, and his bishop on g6 ends up becoming a very, very bad piece. And then after the game, he criticized this move quite heavily. He said it was like the worst move he played of the tournament, which I thought was quite funny. Okay, so now it's white to play, and I didn't really hesitate here. I just went for b4 immediately. Now it's like kind of a reverse Benko style gambit, but as far as Benko gambits go, it looks like an absolute dream. In case of c takes b4, a3, and the engine actually suggests b3 here, just not accepting the pawn sacrifice, but immediately giving back the pawn. And after something like knight takes b3, e5, queen d2, white has a small plus here. I mean, just better position, like the bishop on g2 is nice. I have easy play with my rooks coming to the b and c files. I can push my c pawn, and yeah, black still has to figure out how he's going to get this bishop into play, because the position is quite passive. If he were to accept the pawns, then yeah, just to show this line, it's like white just gets a dream like Benko gambit, all the pieces coming into play. Black has nothing to do but passively defend. And there are even lines like this, queen c7, queen a5, kind of like a typical theme, where even though we've sacrificed a pawn, we're perfectly willing to go into the endgame because we're going to have so much pressure, and more likely than not, white is going to be winning both of these pawns in the near future. And yeah, it just looks like a fantastic endgame for white, probably winning. So yeah, after spending some time, he ends up going for b6, just securing the pawn on c5, not accepting the sacrifice. I think this was probably the right call, but it turns out white gets some initiative here as well, because after b takes c5, b takes c5, black is left with a very clear weakness here. So I immediately start putting pressure, queen a3, queen c7, and at this point I was starting to feel slightly optimistic. Not hugely so, but I felt like, okay, now white is in total control. I'm the one with kind of the strategic advantage here, and I was really hoping to try and convert this one. So rook a b1, rook b6, and I think I had anticipated my move ahead of time, but I was quite happy to find the strongest move here. And this might be a good exercise for you guys to pause the video and try to figure out how white should continue here, how to put the most pressure on the queen side. Okay, so initially, of course, I thought about a move like knight b3, but my problem here was that in case black, let's say, defends the pawn with the rook, I just didn't see a clear way to follow up here. But black does have an idea to create counterplay, and that is to push e5 and then e4. So if black is able to get this in without my knight on d2, then the bishop on g6 comes in alive, and my pawn on d3 is going to be a serious weakness. Not to mention black will have like e3 ideas as well, just kind of busting up my king side. So I felt like I don't have all the time in the world here. Maybe white is probably still better, but I really like the move I came up with during the game, and that was rook b5. So it's very important to lift the rook to this square, specifically because I'm not only hitting the c5 pawn, but I'm also threatening rook a5, which is actually a pretty nasty threat, and this kind of shows the power of this bishop on g2. You could argue that it's like an empty bishop, it's not attacking anything, but it is covering all of these squares and not letting black's pieces utilize these squares, which means there's just like no way to defend the a7 pawn, and white is just breaking through. So after rook b5, black is basically forced to take. C takes b5, and this allows knight d5, but the problem for black is white can just snap it off, and I'm still putting massive pressure on the c5 pawn. So if we were to get like a structural change like this, dynamically black can create some threats like rook e8 or queen e5 to hit the e2 pawn, but white is actually just collecting way more material here, because once the c5 pawn goes, the d4 pawn will also go, and the a7 pawn is hanging, and so once a7 goes, my b5 pawn becomes very strong. And so this is a very difficult position for black. I think objectively the engine thinks it's winning here. Yeah, like rook c8, rook c1, and I'm just taking on c5. And yeah, black just doesn't have time to take anything because I'm threatening the back rank in all of these lines. So after c takes b5, he comes up with the only move here, rook b8, hitting the pawn. And yeah, if I do something like, let's say, queen b3 or rook b1, rook b1, I wasn't exactly sure what's going to happen here. Maybe he can go for knight d5 now. So the problem is once his rook is on b8, he can go for the structure because knight b3 he takes on b5, or rook c1 he takes on b5, and that's not clear at all. So I played basically the only move, bishop c6. I have to defend the pawn, I think, this way. Queen b3 I was also considering, but I feel like this runs into just even the immediate queen a5, or maybe even a6, a4 first, and then eventually queen a5 and taking the pawn. So yeah, after a while I realized bishop c6 is basically the only way to keep fighting for the advantage. And okay, c5 pawn is hanging, so this is quite serious. If he plays queen b6, I'll just play knight c4, and he's forced to go back. So he goes for knight d5. And now again, if I take on d5, e takes d5, it's not quite the same because he's putting pressure on this b5 pawn and he's ready to take it. But instead I am able to take on c5 here. I mean, I was already calculating these lines ahead of time because I realized after queen c5, of course he wants to play knight to c3. And now the e2 pawn is hanging with check, and he's also threatening to take on b5. But as I realized during the game, black isn't getting that much counterplay. And again, strategically, if the battle is raging on the queen side, then his bishop on g6 is kind of out of the game, and so it's like white is almost playing with an extra piece. So intuitively, I felt like dynamically, white should be doing quite well here, but I still had to calculate accurately to figure it out. Okay, so the engine finds an amazing move here that gives white a big advantage that I did not even consider, queen c4. And this one is just, I mean, this one is a little bit too subtle for me. I can't imagine what kind of player would be able to find this move. But the point is simply after knight takes e2 check, king g2, black is currently up a pawn, or having won back the pawn, but the knight on e2 is fishy, the pawn on d4 is hanging, and it's actually quite difficult for black to hold the position together. Something like e5, and then white goes rook e1, knight c3, knight f3, and there's no f6. So this is one of the points behind the move queen c4, is that it prevents black from playing f6 in these positions. So if you can imagine, there are some lines where the queen is on c5, pawn goes to f6, and if white plays this bishop d5 check, thinking it's winning, black can play knight takes d5 and defend the queen. So the queen specifically needs to be on c4. I think the main point, though, is queen c4 actually just defends the a2 pawn and prepares to play a4. And if white gets to play a4 in this position, then everything on the queen side is kind of solidified, and the bishop on c6 is just very, very strong. So yeah, this was a really interesting move. I mean, giving up the e2 pawn, which is a big concession because now the d3 pawn is going to be weak. But the engine, okay, it just sees that objectively white is playing rook e1 next move, the d4 pawn is hanging, and eventually white is just going to be winning a pawn here. So instead of this, I played the move rook e1, which I thought was the best in the position. And it does end up giving the advantage because black only has one move here to equalize, and that was the move e5, which is, yeah, a very, very subtle move because if we remember, black has already given up one pawn. He plays knight c3, rook e1, and then he can take two pawns on a2 or on b5, but instead is supposed to play this e5 move, securing the d4 pawn. So yeah, this is like computer stuff. I mean, it's hard to imagine a lot of players considering this. I mean, the move definitely makes sense. You secure everything before winning back your material. But psychologically, it's very difficult when these pawns are hanging. Instead, he went for knight takes b5. Actually, I should point out an important point here is that rook takes b5 is also possible, but would run into queen takes d4. And then the bishop on c6 can't be taken because queen d8 check is a mate threat, but the rook is now hanging and the knight is under attack too. And so black, I don't think this is working for black. I think black is basically just busted. Instead, he takes with the knight. And for the moment, material is equal, but I knew that white still has some initiative here. And I came up with this move, knight to f3, which turns out to be a very, very strong move. It actually looks more logical to do one of two things, either knight b3 or let's say rook c1, in order to kind of defend the queen and unpin and threaten to take on b5. But rook c1 simply runs into knight c3 again, and he's hitting the e2 pawn and the a2 pawn, so that doesn't really make sense. And initially my thought was to play knight to b3, which I thought was quite nice because I'm hitting the d4 pawn, I'm defending my queen, which means I'm also threatening to take on b5. But I realized black has this move e5 here, and I'm just not really in time to create further threats. And so black is holding on. I mean, just barely, but still holding. So this is when I kind of came up with the move knight f3. It's just like, oh, well, I can hit d4 and cover the e5 square and not let black play this move e5. And this ends up being a huge difference. Now I did have to calculate here very concretely because I am leaving my queen on c5 hanging and the bishop on c6 pinned. And black has moves like rook b6 and rook c8 attacking everything. But I just saw that, you know, everything is covered. Like rook b6, I can play the move rook to c1, and knight c3 looks extremely dangerous, but knight takes d4, and white has everything under control, and black can't do anything. Rook takes c6. I can take with the queen here, and not worry about knight takes e2 check because king just moves out of the way and black doesn't have time to take because his back rank is always going to be hanging here. Or I can also take with the knight on c6 here. I thought this was a nice line as well. Knight takes e2. Again, I move my king and black doesn't have time to take the rook because white will have knight e7 check at the end. So the tactics are basically working for white in this line. And because black can't play e5, he has a big problem with his d4 pawn because I'm putting a lot of pressure here, threatening to play a4 and kick his knight. Rook c8 is just met with queen takes b5, and yeah, so this was quite tough for him. Also, a move like queen b6, trying to go for the endgame and get counterplay here. White has a very nice idea to kind of stabilize the advantage. So knight takes d4, rook to b2. I was really considering this one because it looks like black might be getting some counterplay, but white has a really important move, rook to c1 here, threatening the back rank, forcing black to spend a tempo on h6, and then rook c2, and I get to keep my extra pawn, and everything is totally under control, and should be great winning chances. Okay, so after some thought, he plays a6, which I thought made sense. Here I played rook to c1, and yeah, if something like knight a7 or rook c8, I can just take the pawn on d4, and my bishop is well protected. Actually, he showed me this line after the game, knight a7. I wasn't quite thinking about this one, but I realized it does have some point because he's hitting the bishop and potentially threatening e5. But it turns out that white is totally fine. I can make almost any move here. In fact, I can even play knight to b3, defending the queen and threatening to unpin, with the point that if queen takes c6, then I can take on a7 here, and white is just doing excellent. Or if knight takes c6, I have a nice move, knight a5. So I'm temporarily down a piece, but I'm winning it back thanks to the huge pin on the c-file. Queen takes a5. Queen takes a5, of course, and yeah. Otherwise, I'm just taking on c6. And again, this poor bishop on g6 is just out of the game, can't re-enter. So this is all working out for white. Instead, after rook c1, he plays knight c3, which is what I was mainly expecting. And yeah, you know, the thing here is I missed another chance, mainly because I was already looking forward to playing the position after knight takes d4, knight takes a2. Specifically, I wanted to play the move rook to c4 here, but we'll get to why I didn't later on. So it's because I had this nice option, I didn't really pause too much at this point to consider my other options here. But white has this very, very subtle move, rook c2. This one is not as subtle as the queen c4 move before. Here it's pretty obvious I'm just defending my pawns and getting ready to take on d4 next move. And yeah, for some reason this just didn't cross my mind. Normally this kind of thing is very straightforward. When you're attacking a pawn and your opponent is attacking a pawn, you should try to see if you can just defend your pawn, and then if they can't defend theirs, well, you're going to be collecting next move. It's a pretty simple idea, but if you're not looking for it, it's very easy to forget about it. Yeah, somehow this move rook c2 just didn't cross my mind as being possible. But now both pawns are protected. Black can't play e5. And my bishop on c6 is a target, but I'm still ready to play knight takes d4 next move, after which his knight will also be hanging, and so on c3. So he, just doesn't have time to do anything. He has to play like queen b6, go for the endgame, but white is just winning a lot of material here. And not to mention I still have back rank ideas, and the bishop on g6 is out of the game. So that was probably my biggest miss in this game. I think if I find this move, it's really, really good winning chances. I mean, I'm going up a pawn and going to be keeping like a big strategic advantage. Instead, after knight takes d4, knight takes a2. I still think white is better here, but number one, I'm not a pawn up, so that's kind of important. So the advantage is not as big. So yeah, I really wanted to make this move rook c4. And actually, I didn't realize the threat is to play rook a4 and just trap the knight. But not only trap the knight, but also hit the pawn. Meaning I thought black was going to play a5 here in order to get the knight out to b4. And I didn't realize that after rook a4, I'm just going to be picking up on a5 next move. And white is just fully consolidating here. Knight takes c6, knight takes c6. Actually, I don't even think this is playable for black because like rook a7 is coming and knight e7 check. And yeah, white is just totally dominating. Black doesn't have to play a5 here. I think after the game we were discussing queen b6. But then for sure I should have gone for this position compared to what happened in the game. My idea with rook c4 is not just to trap the knight, but actually also to play for this idea to play h4, which I thought was actually quite clever. Because I'm threatening to push h5 and trap the bishop. If black plays h5 themselves, then when bishop comes back to f3, I'm going to be hitting this pawn on h5. Instead, if after h4, if black plays h6, then white pushes h5 and forces the bishop back to h7, where the bishop is even more passive than it was before, and it's blocking the king, which gives black a lot of back rank issues for the rest of the game. Not to mention, there are some endgames where my rook, let's say, reaches the 7th rank, the knight jumps around to e5, and black can't defend the f7 pawn. And so, yeah, I felt like white is just having a huge initiative here. I mean, my structure is better. Of course, the a pawn is weak, but also my pieces are just so much more active and well organized. Eventually, I ended up deciding against this simply because I thought after the move bishop f3 that white is also getting like a very, very similar type of position, but I'm just going right for the endgame where I felt like I would have a big advantage. And I think that is relatively true if after queen takes e5, rook takes e5, we could get this position. So the point is now I'm again wanting to play like h4, h5. The engine gives some line already as like knight b4. I can even play knight c6 here, which I don't know if I was considering this during the game, but probably if we reached this position, I would have taken a second look here. Maybe played h4 first and then go for knight c6. But yeah, this knight c6 idea, just trading off the knights, very logical, leaving black with a very bad bishop. White should be able to pick up this pawn quite easily since black still needs to fix their back rank issue. And we would get some endgame like this where actually it's definitely not obvious that white is winning here, and I think objectively it's very unclear. The computer is not going to be able to give a clear opinion here. If it's like +3 or something, you can understand that white is winning, but it's more like +1.5, and yeah, that's very unclear. But clearly white would have great chances just with an extra pawn, like good pieces. The problem is all the pawns are on one side of the board and black has no weaknesses. So if I'm going to win, it's going to be like through very, very slow, like d4, e3, maybe e4, d5, probably making this pass pawn, bringing my king to the center. But it'll be tough because black's king is also very close and he can defend against this passed pawn. So this would be a big advantage, but not winning. I would say earlier this move rook c2, I think this would have given white a much bigger edge, because here I'm just going up a pawn and keeping a lot more pieces on the board. But in any case, that was more or less irrelevant, because after bishop f3, black is actually not forced to trade queens here. I thought queen takes c5 was almost forced, just because knight takes c1, okay, of course is not possible because the queen is hanging, and if the queen moves away somewhere, he has to be very careful about not allowing queen c8 check. So yeah, I thought queen takes c5 is kind of the only move here. But then he bangs out a nice resource. Actually, I'll give you guys a chance to pause the video and try to find it. But black to play and essentially save the game, find the best defensive resource. Okay, so he found this move, rook b1, which was just a bolt from the blue. Totally unexpected, because I thought he's the one with back rank problems, not me, right? But yeah, it's kind of it's a very nice concept. The main point is if I take on c7, he takes on c1, and we're essentially just trading heavy pieces. But that's quite important, because here we reach an endgame where black's pawn on a6 is still a weak pawn, but it's a lot harder to attack if I don't have any heavy pieces. In fact, my knight can't really attack it effectively. Whenever I get to c5, he just pushes a5. And my bishop obviously can only attack it if it's on a light square. So if this pawn is just sitting on like a5, or even sometimes an a6, and the knight comes to b4, white just has a very tough time putting pressure on this pawn. So without heavy pieces, this endgame is actually much closer to a draw. The engine gives some advantage here, like 0.6, 0.7, but it seems like it's not enough to really pose substantial winning chances for white. I think, I'm not sure what that evaluation is coming from. It's clear that white is definitely still better with more active pieces, and the king is getting to the queen side first. But, even if I do win the pawn on a6, which is not a given, that endgame, the 5 versus 4, really unclear if white is winning that one. Although I don't think white can even get that by force. So yeah, going back after rook b1, if I play rook takes b1, which is my other option, then after queen takes c5, rook b8 check, queen f8, black is basically saving this again, takes, and yeah, here the king is even one step closer, so it's kind of a better version of this endgame. So yeah, without this move rook b1, then after bishop f3, white is keeping a pretty sizable advantage. Rook c4 I think was objectively stronger. And I was kicking myself for not going for this after the game, because I had seen the move and I'd evaluated that white is doing quite well here, but still didn't have enough to go for it. So bishop f3, rook b1, I end up taking on c7 here. I just didn't see a better option. Takes. I played king f1, knight jumps out to a2, and h4. This move is probably not the best, because I was thinking because of the threat of h5, black might have to play h6, and then h5, bishop h7. I've kind of pushed his bishop out of the way again. I can play king e1. Here it's not as good, because black no longer has like back rank issues to worry about, because I have no pieces to check with. But yeah, if I had got this would be definitely a better version of this endgame, because my king is trying to run in and pick up the pawn before black can get too much counterplay. But he finds a very nice move. After h4, he just ignores it with knight b4. And his point is that after h5, he'll have this move e5. And if I move my knight away, which I probably should, his bishop comes out, and black is doing fine. If I take on g6 here, e takes d4. Actually, it's only black who can be better in this position. Takes, and I was calculating, if my king could run to the queen side here. But the pawn reaches a3, I play king b1, and then black just does nothing. And then this construction is very annoying, because the king basically can't make any progress. The bishop can't attack anything on a dark square, and yeah, it's not clear if black is winning here, but if anyone's playing for the win, it is definitely black, who has a very mobile king. So yeah, I realized I can't go for that. Instead, after knight b4, I just continue shuffling with my king. So this h4 move was kind of a loss of a tempo. Had I not played it and just went for, let's say, king e1 right away, I do get some chances here because the king gets one move closer than in the game. Let's say f6, king c3. In the game here, his bishop was already on f7, so it turns out to be a little bit different. Knight a2, king a3, knight c2, king a4. And yeah, I think the engine was still not giving white anything too serious here, maybe like 0.7 or 0.8. But basically, yeah, some position like this, it's still very tough to win for white. If I play like knight c5, I have to immediately watch out for knight d4. And the problem is, all the time it takes to grab this pawn, my king is going to end up very misplaced on a6 in the future. There's the whole battle is going to now take place on the king side, and if black keeps the knight on the board, this knight can always kind of jump around and attack my pawns. So yeah, it was never really clear how white is going to convert this one for me, but I haven't done a super deep analysis. I think I'll have to take a closer look afterwards. Okay, so h4, knight b4, I start bringing in my king, e5, knight b3, f6, king d2, bishop f7, knight a5, and bishop d5. I think this is actually probably quite an accurate move. Black doesn't have to do this to hold the game. I think a move like king f8, he's defending here, because after king c3, he always just gives check and comes back, and yeah, with his bishop on f7, it's very hard for my king to make progress. I was thinking about this move, knight c4, in this position, just to block the bishop off and again try to prepare my king coming forward. Yeah, but after king e7, it turns out he's doing quite all right. But yeah, he went for bishop d5, which I think is an interesting choice. If I take on d5 and go for this knight endgame, honestly, to me, it wasn't even clear that white is even better here anymore, because now we know knight endgames are similar to king and pawn endgames, and he's the one with like an outside pass pawn. And so my king gets a little bit more active than his, so I think white is still totally fine and probably the one pushing at least a little bit. But yeah, objectively, I felt like black should be doing just fine here, because yeah, as soon as my king gets to b6, his knight just jumps to e6, I take, he'll have knight c5 check, and taking on d3, and then it's black who's better with my king so far out of the way. So after bishop d5, I played bishop g4, or I was also thinking about bishop g4, but it doesn't lead to much. Black is still totally fine. Instead, I played e4. I actually just decided to force a draw here. He actually offered me a draw a couple moves prior to this when we went for the endgame. And, I mean, objectively, the position is drawn, but of course I felt like I could at least try for a bit and see how he's going to deal with my king coming in. And yeah, once he found like a pretty accurate defensive setup, I decided to basically call it a day. So e4, bishop e6, king c3, and we basically repeated moves here, as neither side can really do much of anything. So yeah, overall, not a bad game for sure. I think I played reasonably well. Black definitely made like the critical mistake in this game, pushing d4 on move 15. After this, it was clear that just white was the one kind of playing for the advantage. And yeah, I'm a bit miffed that I didn't find this kind of nice, quiet move, rook c2, just like keeping everything defended and collecting on d4 next move. But well, yeah, what can you do? You're always gonna miss stuff. I think had I found this, would have had a lot more chances. And then maybe with rook c4, I could have put more pressure as well, because black still has to answer some questions here for sure. So yeah, with this draw, I finish on 5.5 out of 10 plus 1. I think I'm gaining maybe something like 10 rating points. Not a whole lot. I think I lost the same or more in my previous tournament, the Bay Area International. It's kind of interesting. I had 3 losses against GMs which were pretty one-sided, I would say. I mean, the game with Ivanchuk for sure. The previous game against Humpy Canero was also, I think, one-sided, where I just got a very difficult position with black right from the get-go and just suffered the whole game. And then the game I lost with white against Sipke Ernst, I mean, definitely I had my chances there, but that game was almost lost in the preparation stage because I entered a opening variation that's like so sharp with very little knowledge of any concrete details and rather just some general ideas. And yeah, it was not a surprise that I immediately misplayed the position and got mated or losing material super quickly. So apart from these three games, my three losses in the event were quite bad. The other seven were quite okay. I had, I think, four wins, three against lower rated players, but okay, still quite decent players like Masters and FIDE Masters. But one nice win against the International Master in the earlier rounds. It's probably the best game from the result point of view. Although objectively the game wasn't perfect. And then I had three fairly solid draws against GMs. This game I feel like I was the one pressing for most of it. My other two games against Ramirez and Vasquez were pretty more balanced. Like I don't think anyone had an advantage in any of those games. So yeah, what can I say? Like a pretty solid result. There were definitely some moments where I could have done better. I think I have a couple places that are pretty clear. I can work on in terms of being a little bit more professional and solid in terms of my opening preparation. And yeah, hopefully I can keep making progress. This tournament was definitely a good step in the right direction. And analyzing these games has been incredibly instructive. I think that's always been my favorite part about these tournaments is that you spend like 2 to 3 hours preparing for the game and you learn a ton. You play the game and you learn a lot, and then you go over the game afterwards and you learn even more details about all of these different positions. So I'm definitely very grateful that I got to play like 10 like really, really interesting games. So yeah, I think I'll wrap it up there. Thanks to everyone who's been watching this series. I've seen a lot of super nice comments below, and I'm always very appreciative of that. Yeah, I know not everyone likes watching these kind of long-ish videos, but some people really enjoy them, so I feel like they're worth making. I don't have any future tournaments planned for the moment. I'm sure I'll be playing more this year, but right now I can't even think of an event on the horizon. But most likely I'll start playing some more tournaments in the next couple of months. I definitely want to take some time off and go over all of my games from this month. I've had like 19 really interesting games that I can definitely analyze deeper and take a closer look at the openings and so on, and then try to keep working on my chess and improving from there. Okay, the closing ceremony is starting in a little bit, so I'm gonna go get ready for that, and I'll catch you guys next time. Take care.